Stop Burning Yourself Out, a Zen sleep story. Right now, there is a thinned, cold vibration radiating outward through your ribcage lines and the spaces between the ribs, an unmistakable physical sensation of emptiness hollowed out right behind your chest wall. It is the specific somatic residue of carrying everyone else's emotional weight, while your own baseline reservoir has run completely dry. You are experiencing the deep, hollow ache of a chronic overgiver, the interior exhaustion that takes hold when you have spent months or years extending your vital energy to sustain the lives, the demands, and the emotional imbalances of those around you, only to find yourself entirely unreciprocated, depleted, and stranded in the dark. Your ribcage feels physically brittle and chilled tonight, holding the quiet shock of a system that has given away its last drop of fuel, leaving nothing but a raw, dry hollow where a vibrant, warm center used to live. The immediate sanctuary of your late-night room is adjusting to the silent hours, offering a cool, dimly lit cellar of rest where the demand to shine can be dropped completely. Outside, the midnight air carries the thick, earthy scent of damp clay and the faint, sweet bitterness of crushed rapeseed pods drifting from a nearby garden path. Inside, the subtle, rhythmic hiss of a single wick burning down in a simple clay saucer on a low wooden stool creates a steady, unhurried focal point for the senses, while the heavy, charcoal-dyed flax mattress beneath your upper body absorbs the direct heat of your shoulders. The cool, unrefined weave of the linen pressing against your sides begins to match the stillness of the floorboards, gently inviting the thinned, overworked muscles surrounding your ribcage to cease their frantic internal bracing. If it feels right, take a slow breath, letting your chest wall yield completely to the firm, supportive ground, allowing the unreciprocated care of your past interactions to remain uncounted in the shadows. You are not broken, dear friend. What you are feeling in this thinned, cold space behind your sternum is not failure. Nor is it proof that your capacity for genuine compassion has been permanently ruined because you have run out of warmth for the world. The profound depletion you carry tonight is a natural baseline, a stark indication that your physical body is wisely refusing to generate light out of a vacuum. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, and we will not demand that you immediately find the strength to forgive or the energy to fix the dynamics that drained you. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, and you do not need to fill your reservoir before you are permitted to let your chest stop burning. Right now, nothing is required of you now, and you are safe enough to soften. There is a startling, liberating paradox embedded within Buddhist wisdom that meets this specific interpersonal exhaustion with an unexpected direct truth. We live under the persistent illusion that true spiritual generosity means an aggressive, endless act of self-depletion, believing that if we can only burn ourselves down to the absolute wood, we will finally secure our safety and prove our value to those we support. We treat our energy as a transaction, hoping that our overgiving will buy us a permanent sanctuary of love and approval from the world. But the profound insight of the Zen tradition reveals that suffering does not arise because we care deeply. The agony takes root when our giving becomes a frantic method of self-defense, separated from the quiet wisdom that protects the source. This is the truth of the empty cedar oil lamp. When a shallow wooden tray draws its woven linen wick so deep into its dry corners that the oil is completely gone, the flame begins to char and consume the vegetative fiber of the wick itself, turning the instrument into soot. The suffering is not the absence of the light, but the violent burning of the vessel. True offering is not a sacrifice of the wood, it is the natural, unforced overflow of a reservoir that is already quietly full from resting in the dark. Maybe you have felt this too, the sudden, terrifying realization at midnight that the people you have spent your youth illuminating have left you to face the winter with a charred, empty chest. The mind turns inward, transforming this deep energetic depletion into an intense personal indictment, whispering that because your reservoir is dry, you are fundamentally selfish, inadequate, and hollowed out. This is the mechanism that adds a second wound to the original sorrow of your exhaustion. The first pain is simply the raw interpersonal reality of a world where people take without looking, resources dry up, and energy leaves the body after a long day of labor. The second pain is the cruel judgment you strike against your own ribcage. declaring that you are ruined simply because your lamp has gone out. But the unglazed clay of an empty jug does not apologize to the well for its lack of moisture, and the dry cedar wood does not dictate the depth of the deep mountain springs. The coldness you track through your ribs is merely a temporary absence of fuel, completely unable to diminish the deep, untroubled awareness that is cradling your body tonight. In a few moments, our attention will journey toward a small, windowless winter meditation cell during a silent mountain freeze, where a temple attendant sat staring at a dry, charred linen, wick stiffened by old soot, feeling the exact same thinned vibration that is weighing down your chest right now. But before we enter that silent, freezing landscape, allow your awareness to notice the physical weight of your upper body. Let the deep spaces between your ribs expand outward. Let the lungs settle down without any restriction, and let the back of your neck release its tight coordination. You do not need to force anything tonight, and you do not have to guarantee that your warmth will return before the morning arrives. The world will manage its own demands without your frantic illumination for the next few hours, and every unreturned favor, every emotional debt, and every empty lamp can remain completely suspended in the dark. We spend so much of our life treating our presence as a light that must always be lit for others, believing that if we allow our flame to die down, we will be left completely abandoned in the cold. We evaluate our worth by the brightness of our utility, and then we wonder why our inner core feels so charred and thinned when the oil runs out. But the dark earth cellar does not feel a shred of guilt for remaining cool beneath the orchard roots, and the unglazed pottery does not apologize to the kitchen for sitting empty in the shade. The suffering you hold does not come from the simple fact that your lamp is currently unlit. It grows from the current resistance that refuses to let the vessel be empty, without demanding that your core immediately ignite itself out of shame. Let another breath arrive naturally, without you needing to measure its depth or direct its shape. Let it fill the spaces behind your sternum, down through the sides of your waist, and deep into the very center of your back. You are nothing more than a living form resting in a quiet room, completely free from the metrics, expectations, and relationships of the waking world. In the deep silence that is growing between us, the cool evening air is moving through the wet clay outside, requiring no bright lights and demanding no endless sacrifices before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the linen against your skin, as we prepare to step onto the frozen stone floor of the winter cell, where the keeper of the fuel jars is waiting to show us how to let the flame go dark. High within the jagged crevices of a northern peak, where the winter wind remained entirely motionless because the freeze was so absolute, a small windowless meditation cell sat buried under the snow. The interior of this stone chamber always smelled faintly of frozen granite, cold ash, and the bitter, sharp aroma of scorched linen fibers that had burned too close to the ceramic oil trays. In this isolated sanctuary lived Ren, a young temple attendant whose daily responsibility was to maintain the illumination of the sacred halls. Ren moved through the long stone corridors with a narrow, protective posture, his shoulders slightly curled inward, carrying a persistent, thinned vibration that hummed coldly through the entire framework of his ribcage. For many months, Ren had secretly kept his own sleeping quarters completely dark, choosing to pour every drop of his personal rapeseed oil into the communal temple jars so that the senior monks would never suffer a single dim hour during their midnight chants. During his early years at the monastery, Ren had struggled with a profound, quiet dread of being found unnecessary or becoming a burden to the community. He had gradually built his entire sense of spiritual presence around the act of absolute self-negation, believing that the brightness of the shrine lamps was a direct reflection of his own devotion. He worked past the point of physical exhaustion, running down the mountain paths to secure more fuel, constantly extending his energy to soothe the tempers and the fatigue of the elder monks, while his own internal reserve turned entirely hollow. When the heavy winter freeze locked the mountain trails, cutting off the supply lines, Ren did not reduce the light in the main hall. Instead, he began to draw the woven linen wicks of the temple lamps down into the very corners of the dry cedar trays, forcing the flames to burn brighter, even as the oil completely disappeared. He spent his nights sitting upright in his freezing cell, holding his hands tightly across his chest, paralyzed by a cold internal exhaustion born from realizing he had nothing left to give, yet terrified that if his light failed, he would be cast out into the snow. The keeper of the monastery's fuel supplies was Master Sokan, an elderly monk who spent his winters in the lower storehouses, whose face was lined like the bark of an old cedar tree, and whose movements carried the heavy, unhurried rhythm of thick oil poured from a wide stone jar. Sokan did not deliver long discourses on the virtue of sacrifice or the nature of emptiness, spending his hours cleaning the ceramic pressers and ensuring that the storage vessels remained insulated against the frost. He had been quietly observing the progressive thinning of Ren's physical frame, recognizing the brittle, defensive way the young attendant held his ribcage whenever he carried the heavy copper ladles through the freezing dark. On a night when the mountain fog had turned the outer courtyard into an unmoving wall of white ice, Sokan called Rin into the smallest fuel cell beneath the shrine. The room was perfectly silent, save for the faint crystalline click of frost forming along the stone seams of the wall. In the center of the low wooden workbench, resting under the dim glow of a single tallow candle, lay a dry, charred linen wick stiffened by old soot, a piece of twisted fiber that had been pulled so deeply into a dry lamp tray that the fire had begun to eat the material itself. Ren stood near the doorway, his arms crossed tightly over his sternum, the thinned vibration behind his chest wall intensifying as he watched the old fuel keeper reach out with his rough fingers. The attendant assumed he was about to be scolded for wasting the linen, or failing to keep the large bronze lamps fully filled, his internal muscles tightening as he prepared to defend the purity of his constant sacrifices. Master Sokan did not inspect the copper oil jars, and he did not look at the temple ledgers. Instead, he lifted the dry, charred linen wick from the wood, placed its stiffened, blackened form directly into the palm of Ren's hand, and asked the young man to feel exactly what happens to an instrument when it tries to generate a flame entirely out of its own substance. Rin held the blackened fiber, the soot leaving dark, dry smudges against the skin of his palm, his breath catching in his throat with a sudden, sharp recognition of his own internal state. As he looked down at the workbench, he whispered that the wick was ruined, its flexibility completely lost to the heat, having become so brittle that a single firm touch would turn it into useless dust. He confessed that the cold, hollow space behind his own ribs felt exactly like this charred piece of linen, a dry, burned out knot where all the natural warmth had been spent to keep the temple bright, leaving him to face the winter with a chest that felt entirely thinned, empty, and dead. The old fuel keeper reached down, took a small ceramic vial of unrefined rapeseed oil and poured a single slow drop directly onto the unburnt tail of the stiffened linen in Ren's hand. Sokan told the young attendant that the error of the lamp was not the size of the flame or the duration of the night, but the delusion that the linen was the source of the light. The elder monk pointed out that a true offering requires the wood or the fiber to remain completely saturated in the dark, allowing the oil to carry the heat while the vessel itself rests undisturbed by the fire. The suffocating depletion Ren carried did not come from his genuine desire to help the monastery. It grew entirely from his own exhausting habit of standing in the dark, pulling his own fiber into the flame, and believing that his worth as a human being was measured by how quickly he could burn himself to ash for the comfort of others. Ren remained completely motionless on the cold stone floor, the thick, heavy scent of the pressed rapeseed oil settling deep into his senses as his fingers slowly uncurled from their tight grip around the charred linen. For the first time since the winter freeze began, the rigid, knotted constriction surrounding his chest wall began to soften, allowing a deep, unhurried breath to reach the very bottom of his lungs. He looked at the single drop of oil slowly spreading through the dry fibers, realizing that the light he had been trying to force was never his personal property to give it, was a natural resource that could only flow when the vessel was willing to sit empty, cold, and hidden in the dark storehouse. Slowly, the heavy, unhurried stillness of that frozen fuel storehouse moves into the quiet space of your own dark room tonight. letting the image of the charred linen wick mirror the exact condition of your own overworked heart. You have been lying awake, replaying the demands of those you support, measuring the depth of the cold void inside your chest, and letting the continuous depletion of your energy convince you that your spirit is permanently hollowed out. You have believed that because you have run out of warmth for the world, your actual capacity to hold value has been destroyed. But the deep, unmeasured reservoir of your true nature remains completely intact, entirely indifferent to the number of lamps that have gone out in the dark. Let the empty trays sit on the table, allowing your awareness to settle into the wide, peaceful depth of this single hour. This reflection on the charred linen wick and the freezing storage room is not telling us to stop feeling the profound fatigue of an overextended life, nor is it asking us to become cold, unyielding stone walls that remain completely unbothered when the people we support leave us stranded in the dark. It is not an invitation to build a state of forced detachment, where we pretend that running entirely empty on emotional resources does not leave a genuine deep ache inside our physical chest. Instead, it is revealing an internal movement that is much quieter, a gentle shift in perspective that allows us to witness the draining of our reservoir without allowing that dry space to define our absolute capacity to live. The persistent, thinned vibration that rests directly within the center of your ribcage tonight does not persist simply because the external demands were heavy. The deepest suffering takes root when the mind insists on holding that empty tray as the permanent, final measure of your internal value. When we look at this lat-night depletion through the clear, simple lens of Buddhist insight, we see that what we often describe as attachment is actually that stubborn, defensive knot behind the sternum that declares, until I can see my efforts perfectly returned and completely approved, my entire system must remain in a state of active, rigid sacrifice. It is the exhausting habit of locking our fundamental stability into the validation of external relationships, desperately trying to maintain a bright illumination, just to convince ourselves that we are safe from rejection. We treat our personal energy as if it were a wick that must never burn low, and when the oil runs dry, we believe our actual spirit has been reduced to ashes. This is the modern reality of craving. It is the frantic, Latinite looping that keeps us mentally anticipating the next demand or replaying past interactions, hoping that one more round of emotional labor will somehow secure our sanctuary and save us from the void. But a dry piece of fiber stiffened by soot cannot dictate the depth of the wide mountain springs. No matter how many times you replay the lack of reciprocation against the dark ceiling of your room, the hard labor has already ended, the energy has already shifted, the oil has already been spent. When we lie awake burning our vital reserves to maintain these old obligations, we are participating in a quiet internal process that adds a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw interpersonal reality of a changing world where people take without noticing. Fuel runs dry, and physical exhaustion arrives without checking our limits. These experiences are genuinely heavy, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable movement of human existence. The second wound, however, is the one we strike against our own center when our thoughts turn inward and declare, because your lamp has gone out, you are permanently selfish, useless, and ruined. Let this quiet realization sit directly next to the thinned vibration in the middle of your chest right now. Consider what happens when we replace that desperate desire for constant utility with simple, spacious awareness. This quality of mind is not a complex discipline that you must perform perfectly before you are permitted to rest your head. It is simply the capacity to look directly at the empty tray of your relationships without allowing that dryness to dictate the width of your current breath. It is the ability to observe the rigid sadness in your ribs, to label it gently as the old habit of defining yourself by the light you provide, and to recognize that the soot belongs entirely to the spent linen, not to the wide, uncarved landscape that is holding you tonight. When you allow the dry wick to rest on the workbench without continuously gripping the charred fibers with your thoughts, you stop feeding the friction that keeps your sternum raw. You let the depletion exist in the past, while you remain open in the present room. Impermanence, when translated into the immediate texture of your evening rest, becomes an immense sanctuary for an overworked heart. It acts as a gentle reminder that the emotional depletion you feel was not a solid, eternal block trapped inside your identity. That grand offering was a temporary arrangement of energy that belonged to a specific season. It has no physical power to reach into the dark and diminish the deep, untroubled awareness that is watching it tonight. The body lying in this room is entirely separate from those unreturned favors. Its lungs capable of dropping into a clean, ancient rhythm that has never been restricted by the demands of a shrine. You do not have to force your current muscles to maintain a defensive guard just to protect a light that has already returned to the dark. True letting go does not mean you abandon your care for those you love, or that you pretend the emptiness did not feel heavy. It means you stop using the brightness of your lamp as a metric to determine whether you are permitted to take a full, unhurried breath in the dark. It means you acknowledge the thinned, dry channels of your chest, look at the wreckage with a soft, non-judgmental eye, and then allow the fire to die down completely without demanding that your spirit ignite itself before you are allowed to sleep. When you drop the expectation that your life must always hold an active flame for the world to see, you discover that true compassion is the willingness to stand in your own empty center and hold your vulnerable frame with a tenderness that requires no external return. Right now, notice how effortlessly your body is managing its own survival in the dark, completely unconcerned with the heavy ladles you tried to carry during the daylight hours. Your pulse does not check the status of your generosity before it agrees to warm your limbs, and your lungs do not demand an intact reservoir from the mountain before they open to receive the cool night breeze. You are already being sustained by a deep, natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of human utility, resting securely within a night that requires no bright lights before it offers you its peace. Let your awareness sink into the simple, unrefined texture of the linen against your skin as we prepare to step onto the cool dirt floor of the earth cellar, where the oil presser is waiting to show us the nature of the space that remains when the jars are laid down. If it feels right, let your attention gather very gently right at the center of your ribcage, arriving at the exact physical boundaries where that thinned, cold vibration has been anchoring its energy. There is no need to actively push the memory of the external demands away, and there is no requirement to make your mind completely quiet by force. Simply notice the physical texture of the emptiness, observing the stubborn hollow sensation behind your sternum, as if you were merely looking at a dry, charred linen wick resting on a workbench, without any urgency to scrub the soot or force the fiber to catch fire again. As you rest here in the deep, indigo-shadowed stillness of the late evening hour, perhaps you can invite a slow wave of softening to move through the deep muscles of your chest wall and upper shoulders. Let the small, rigid fibers surrounding your ribs loosen their protective grip, allowing the lungs to drop naturally, and let your upper body feel wide, as if it were dissolving into the cool, dark soil beneath your frame. There is no pressure to achieve a sudden state of profound emotional healing in this moment, and even just noticing that your internal muscles still feel tight, guarded, or hollowed out is entirely enough. You are simply taking stock of your own internal landscape, acknowledging where the mind has been buckle-strapping its armor against the vast uncertainty of interpersonal depletion. Right now, let the specific memory of that unreciprocated care float up into your awareness. Perhaps the exact moment where you realized your energy was completely spent, the exhaustion of watching your warmth leave without return, or the general, heavy worry that you will be completely cast aside if anyone sees the unlit space in your foundation. Do not try to analyze the validity of the demands, and do not try to fix the perception of the people you wish to illuminate. Instead, just name the emotional pattern that is currently tightening across your chest. You might say to yourself, very quietly, "This is the habit of standing over the empty tray," or "This is the old defensive heat trying to burn the wick down to the wood." Just by naming it, you are stepping out of the dark, urgent internal courtroom and standing beside Master Soken in the freezing cell, looking at the blackened fiber from a place of unhurried safety. Imagine that your vanished energy is like that dry, charred linen wick, its natural texture having become stiffened and covered in soot from months of continuous sacrifice. Look at its fractured shape in your mind's eye. See how many times your thoughts have gripped that unrefined material today, fixing your sight entirely upon the spent utility, letting that cold ditch convince you that your true nature has been permanently ruined. In this quiet space, if it feels comfortable, imagine taking that heavy, burning need to appear completely helpful, that persistent wish to hide your natural emptiness, and allowing it to rest quietly inside the dry, blackened layers of the fiber. You do not have to illuminate the hall with your exhaustion, and you do not have to make the tray full. You are simply setting the wick down on the wood, while you step back into your own breathing body. Watch what happens to the internal space across your ribs as you let the responsibility sit outside of your identity. Perhaps the image of the blackened wick begins to change its texture under the steady, cool sweep of the night air. The faint, thick aroma of pressed rapeseed oil rises from the lower storehouses, filling the room with a clean, grounded quality that has nothing to do with the forced light. The mountain does not collapse, and the stones remain completely solid beneath your weight, holding their space with absolute security. The soot on the workbench does not diminish the capacity of the cedar to hold the fuel. It is simply a layer of dust in the cell, entirely separate from the deep, unmeasured springs that are holding you tonight. If your thoughts begin to drift back toward the main hall, the expectations of the senior monks, or the jars you wish you could fill to prove your absolute worth, you can return to the simple, rhythmic expansion of your lower lungs whenever you are ready. There is no failure in a mind that wanders back to its exhaustion. The slow hiss of the small flame outside the window pane does not apologize for moving in the dark, and your memories are no different from that natural occurrence. They are simply configurations resting in your vast, open hall of awareness, and they cannot permanently break your true self unless you choose to believe that you are the charred linen. Nothing needs to be forced tonight, dear friend. You are not required to empty your heart of its fatigue through an act of sheer will, and you do not have to guarantee that your warmth will return before the morning light arrives. You are simply a living form, letting the heavy, unalterable roles of the keeper rest in the dark, while the unmoving soil continues to cradle your center, leaving your inner storehouse wide, unlit, and deeply at peace. Farther down the mountain ridges, where the steep rock faces smoothed into the dark loam of a remote hillside orchard, the orchards grew silent under the winter sky. The atmosphere in this deep earth cellar always carried the absolute chill of hidden masonry, the cool aroma of stored roots, and the thick, heavy scent of raw, pressed rapeseed sediment left at the bottom of the vats. In this subterranean environment lived Kanto, a village caretaker who had spent the entire harvest season carrying massive copper water skins from the low valley wells to fill the dry stone cisterns of everyone else in the settlement. Kanto moved down the stone steps with a rigid, protective gait, his shoulders pulled slightly forward, carrying that same distinct thinned vibration radiating coldly through the outer lines of his rib cage. Only 2 suns prior, his physical frame had completely collapsed from exhaustion in the middle of the village square, leaving his own household storage jars completely dry and caked with old sediment, while the rest of the community enjoyed the fruits of his labor. Instead of resting his depleted limbs after the fall, Kanto had been consumed by a sharp, defensive panic, returning to the empty cellar jars at twilight with an iron ladle. He spent hours scraping the dry interior walls of his own pottery, his mind spinning with a fierce anxiety that he would be judged as useless or stripped of his role as the community protector if he could not immediately find a way to offer more sustenance to his neighbors. The harder he pushed his aching muscles against the flat bottom of the empty vessels, the more his internal vitality fractured, until he found himself slumping against the cold stone floor, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gaps, his fingers trembling with a profound sense of isolation and internal bankruptcy. He felt that his entire social standing had been permanently compromised, his chest holding a cold, tight numbness as he looked at the dark corners of the masonry that held nothing but empty shadow. The only other person who frequented this deep storage space was Mother Chio, an old herbalist who spent the winter months pressing oil from frozen seeds, whose presence carried the slow, unhurried stability of the deep earth, and whose palms were permanently stained a deep golden hue from the oil mills. Chiyo never delivered formal sermons on the nature of non-attachment or the limits of the personal self, spending her hours filtering the dark pressings or checking the alignment of the wooden crushing blocks. She had been quietly tracking the progressive depletion of Kanto's energy over the season, recognizing the desperate, hollow clatter of his empty ladle and the thinned, defensive curvature of his upper torso whenever he stood before the village council. On an evening when the mountain wind had died down so completely that the entire hillside felt like an unmoving room of ice and stone, Chiyo walked into the deep cellar where Kanta lay. She did not offer him a warm cup of broth to patch over his fatigue, and she did not tell him that the village was grateful for his past work. Instead, she reached into the dark space behind the main press, pulled out a smooth, unglazed clay storage jug caked inside with dry rapeseed sediment, an ordinary, heavy vessel that had sat empty in the lowest tier of the cellar for 3 winters, and set it quietly on the stone floorboards beside his trembling hands. Kanto sat with his arms locked tightly over his chest wall, his ribs holding their familiar, brittle constriction. His inner thoughts immediately preparing an angry justification as he looked at the old herbalist. He assumed she was about to criticize his lack of foresight, or tell him that a true caretaker would have filled his own jars before the freeze locked the mountain wells, his internal muscles tightening against the expectation of blame. Mother Chiyo did not lift a copper skin, and she did not inspect the empty cisterns outside the door. Instead, she took the unglazed clay jug, placed her hand against its cold, porous exterior, and asked the young caretaker to observe whether the pottery had lost its essential capacity to contain a harvest simply because it had sat empty and dark in the earth throughout the active months. Sano looked at the rough clay, the yellow crust of old sediment clinging to the inner curves of the vessel, his voice dry and strained with an unspent, bitter resentment as he replied that a jar without oil was merely a piece of useless mud taking up space in the storehouse. He argued that his collapse had proven his inability to sustain the village, leaving his own hearth with nothing but a cold, empty shadow that could no longer offer a single drop of comfort to those who depended on his strength. He confessed, his ribs tightening against the weight of his vulnerability, that his own chest felt exactly like that dry pottery, hollowed out, cold, and completely stripped of its meaning because the reservoir he had used to secure his worth had run entirely empty. The old woman sat quietly on the low wooden stool, the faint sound of liquid dripping into a deep vat somewhere in the dark filling the silence between them. She looked down at the unglazed vessel, touched its cold rim, and told Kanto that the jug was never defined by the speed with which it was emptied, nor did its nature depend on the brightness of the lamps it supplied. Chiyo pointed out that the capacity to hold space lived in the raw, unpolished clay itself, completely independent of the oil that passed through its walls, and entirely preserved when the vessel returned to the dark, cool earth of the cellar. The agonizing thinning Kanto felt behind his sternum did not come from the physical absence of water. In his house, it grew entirely from his own exhausting habit of treating his usefulness as his soul, refusing to let his vessel sit dark in the ground without believing that his internal capacity to love had been ruined by his fatigue. Kanto remained completely still on the cold earth floor, the thick aroma of the pressed rapeseed pods settling deep into his senses as his hands slowly loosened their tight guard across his ribcage. In that silent room of stone and shadow, he chose one small, profound act of discipline. He stopped the habit of treating every self-critical thought as an absolute command, and he stopped fighting the reality of his empty house. He took one long, slow breath before his mind could declare his exhaustion a failure, allowing the dry, silent cellar to exist exactly as it was without his resistance. He realized that the unglazed clay jug was still whole, its capacity to contain space completely intact, waiting silently for the natural moisture of the earth to replenish its pores on its own time. He laid the ladle gently on the floorboards, let his shoulders drop, and allowed the desperate need to perform for the village to dissolve into the quiet depths of the deep mountain floor. This was the transformation, a subtle shift from fighting the natural depletion of his vessel to resting in the raw, uncarved presence of the dark space that remained. As the candlelight flickered against the masonry walls, the thinned, cold vibration wrapping around his ribcage began to soften, letting his awareness expand past the narrow boundary of his interpersonal utility. He recognized that his true value was not the oil he gave away, but the wide, enduring storage room that had allowed the harvest to be gathered, like the unglazed clay jug sitting quietly in the cold earth, entirely at peace with the darkness it carried. When we allow our attention to settle into the quiet spaces of our own Latinite reflections, we begin to decode the hidden emotional engine that converts the natural fatigue of life into an ongoing sentence of internal friction. We often assume that our physical exhaustion is a direct consequence of the visible tasks we performed, or the actual hours we spent managing our outward responsibilities. But if you observe the thinned, cold vibration currently radiating outward through your ribcage lines and the spaces between the ribs, you will find that the real consumer of your vitality is the continuous hidden act of resistance. It is the energetic strain of refusing to let the natural dryness exist in the vessel, the desperate attempt to manipulate the fluid uncertainty of life through the frantic application of your own suffering. We treat our minds as an active laboratory of defense, continuously replaying the past and rebuilding the unlit lamps with the memory of every perceived shortcoming, operating under the tragic delusion that if we keep our inner core raw and alert, we will somehow secure our worth against the changing currents of the world. This is the exact point where we can begin to separate the original weight of existence from the elaborate psychological armor the mind builds on top of it. Buddhist wisdom approaches this dilemma with a beautiful, direct distinction between the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is simply the raw, unpolished impact of being alive in a world constructed out of unpredictable currents and natural human limitations. It is the sudden arrival of deep emotional depletion. It is the natural vulnerability of carrying a heavy load for others. It is the simple reality of being a human being who feels doubt, fear, or sadness when an interpersonal reserve runs dry. These occurrences are genuinely heavy, yes, but they belong to the basic, unpreventable weather of our daily reality. We cannot control the arrival of the first pain, for the heavy freeze does not ask the permission of the caretaker before it sends the frost sliding down the hillside to lock the mountain wells. The true torment begins when our thoughts take that first pain and knead it into a permanent moral identity, actively constructing the second pain out of our own resistance. The second pain is the elaborate mental trial we host right along our chest walls and ribs, where we translate a temporary pattern of structural exhaustion into a definitive commentary on our absolute value. We do not simply notice that we are feeling overwhelmed or empty. The mind turns inward and whispers, "Because you are struggling to hold this together, you are fundamentally inadequate, fraudulent, and banned from true peace." We do not just navigate an intense period of depletion, our thoughts declare. This unlit lamp is proof that your core is inherently defective. This is the mechanism of turning temporary pain into a solid identity, the unfortunate habit of mistaking a natural empty vessel for an absolute pocket of rot that must be covered up with frantic labor. When we exist within this pattern of self-judgment, our awareness spends its Latinite hours rehearsing the future and replaying the past, frantically attempting to build a wall of hypervigilance against the terrifying landscape of human vulnerability. We stay awake repeating every word we spoke during the harvest because we believe that our burning regret is a form of protection, that if we keep the inner dialogue sharp and critical, we will somehow force ourselves to be perfectly unshakable tomorrow. We develop an insatiable need for internal approval, trying to fix the self through a subtle application of shame, using our self-punishment as a temporary payment to satisfy the internal prosecutor we carry in our skin. But trying to heal your exhausted spirit through the accumulation of mental friction is like trying to preserve an unglazed clay jug. By covering the raw walls with thick rapeseed sediment, the crust remains trapped in the center, waiting to restrict your natural breathing the moment the light fades. True inner transformation does not manifest because you have finally forced every single flaw to disappear from your character through sheer willpower. It begins with the radical, quiet realization that peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is an entirely different relationship with the difficulty itself. It is the willingness to stand in the deep storehouse cellar without immediately picking up the iron ladle to scrape your own ribs. When you allow the reality of the empty jar to exist without transforming it into an absolute verdict on your soul, you are stopping the second pain before it can plant its roots in your body. You are choosing to sit quietly among the storage vats in the dark, letting the empty space be empty, and letting the inner room be vast, without needing to apologize to the universe for the lack of fuel running through your foundation. As you let the frame support the heavy framework of your chest right now, notice how the desperate urge to appear perfectly helpful begins to lose its grip when it is met with simple, non-judgmental presence. You do not have to settle the record of your entire social standing before the night ends. And you do not need to guarantee that your reservoir will be fully restored by tomorrow morning. The path toward inner freedom does not ask you to become a magically perfect statue who never experiences the sting of doubt or fatigue. It simply requires the very small, very steady discipline of noticing the thinned vibration along your ribs, naming it as the old defensive pretense, and refusing to give its declarations the authority of truth. You are the vast, open masonry that holds both the raw stone walls and the quiet clay. You are not the charred linen that is currently smoldering away in the dark. In a moment, this gentle insight will move even closer to the small, ordinary triggers of your modern life, showing us how to carry this soft hand into the waking world without guilt. But for now, let your attention sink down into the quiet, unmoving center of your chest. Let your lower ribs expand outward on their own natural rhythm, taking up all the space it requires in the indigo shadows, completely free from the narrow metrics of outward performance. You are safe enough to drop the protective armor right here, leaving your spirit as unpolished, wide, and supportive as the heavy cellar floor before the first copper water skin was ever carried across its surface. Now let this quiet understanding step softly across the centuries, moving out of the silent mountain cellars and directly into the small electric friction of your ordinary evening. The charred linen wick and the sediment-caked clay jug we have been exploring are not abstract concepts designed to live only within an old storehouse archive. They are the exact configurations of energy you hold down in your chest wall and your shoulders when you lie awake at midnight, staring at the blank screen of your phone, waiting for a text message that might validate your value or offer a temporary reassurance that you have not driven away the people you care about. We live so much of our modern lives inside this digital hypervigilance, repeatedly checking our devices for an external metric of our strength, replaying a minor interpersonal mistake or a perceived delay in our life path, as if the sheer force of our anxiety could somehow rewrite the reality of our day. We perform the role of the unshakable anchor during the daylight hours, smiling warmly while feeling an immense heavy thickness inside our chest, carrying the constant worry that we are fundamentally falling behind our peers, or that our true, unpolished self is simply not enough to sustain our connections. You can begin to transform this exhausting mechanism right in the middle of the very moments that cause your breathing to shallow, recognizing that peace is not an allure-nothing victory, but a quality practiced in the smallest, most unexceptional slivers of the day. When you find yourself caught in the frantic urge to control a relationship, check your notifications for validation, or fear the absolute uncertainty of the future, you are fully permitted to pause. A single slow breath taken before you offer an answer, or look at your screen is a profound form of wisdom. It is a quiet, somatic realization that not every self-critical thought deserves your immediate obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command that must be followed into a Latinite internal courtroom. You are simply stepping out into the wide room of your own presence, letting the dusty residue of your daily tasks pass over your mind without allowing it to compromise the permanent, load-bearing foundation of your true stone cellar. Perhaps you have spent years operating under the hidden law that your right to rest must be bought with a continuous display of flawless emotional stability, and that wanting to let your eyes close while your inner difficulties remain unresolved is a form of guilt-ridden failure. We treat our rest as a luxury that must be earned through absolute competence, fearing that if we stop carrying the copper water skins or analyzing our vulnerability, we will be left completely exposed in the dark. But the scarred clay jug does not feel a shred of remorse for sitting empty on the wooden bench, and the raw earth floors do not apologize to the orchard for letting their space remain unlit under the frost. You can rest without earning it first. Your exhaustion is not a moral debt that must be settled through hours of overthinking. It is simply the natural voice of an internal posture that has run out of vital energy from trying to carry the weight of an immaculate shrine. It is entirely possible to care deeply about the work you produce, the people you support, and the growth you desire without gripping their outcomes so fiercely that you crush your own ribcage on the defensive armor. When we attempt to control the future or hide our natural fatigue through the continuous application of our own shame, we are acting like Kanto before his ladle was laid down, refusing to let the reality of the unlit jar exist as a natural configuration of a vast subterranean vault. True inner freedom begins when you allow your living biography to be offered to the world with a loose, receptive hand. You can maintain your daily responsibilities, contemplate your growth, or rest your body with the simple, unforced presence of raw clay, letting the surface pattern exist without demanding that it match a standard of absolute brightness. The next time the creeping thinning of exhaustion settles deep into your chest muscles, when you find yourself comparing your hidden, tired routine to the manufactured triumphs of those around you, look down at the quiet weight of your own posture and take a slow breath. The doubt you hid or the depletion you refused to accept is merely the external weather of a long, unpredictable human existence. You do not have to pretend the internal void did not feel heavy, and you do not have to force an immediate state of complete transformation before the raw edge of your exhaustion has even cooled. It is completely enough to sit with the uncertainty of your own unfinished healing, letting the irregular fragments of your day rest on the floorboards without needing to stamp them with the label of permanent ruin. In a few moments, the remaining definitions and standards of the daylight hours will dissolve entirely into the dark, leaving nothing but the vast, protective space of this midnight room. As your limbs prepare to surrender their final defensive postures, release the illusion that you must secure every single boundary of your public identity before you are permitted to let your sternum relax. The expectations of the day carry no authority in this quiet sanctuary, and the unresolved demands can remain suspended in the cool mist outside your window. Let your attention drop back down into the steady, unhurried rise and fall of your lower lungs, knowing that the load-bearing substance of your true nature is already fully intact, completely wide, and entirely at peace. The dark hour has fully arrived now, and the quiet gravity of the night is settling over your bed like the thick, cool fog that holds the deep storage cellar in absolute stillness. Every single effort you made today, every tireless service you performed beneath your ribs, and every anxious reach for reassurance has dropped its momentum, dissolving into the silence of this indigo-shadowed room. The heavy, unalterable expectations of the mountain ridge are no longer pulling at your chest wall. They have slid away, falling through the floorboards into the damp earth, leaving your internal vault completely empty, spacious, and calm. Your ribcage muscles and your shoulders are sinking a fraction of an inch deeper into the surface beneath you, as if the heavy wood of your inner nature were finally remembering its relationship with the steady, uncarved foundation of the stone masonry. Let your breathing become very small, very quiet, and entirely effortless. There is absolutely no need to regulate the air as it moves down through your throat. The body knows how to expand and soften on its own time, like the slow, steady movement of the winter air passing directly through the dark beams of the oil storehouse. With every long, unhurried release of breath, the distinct, thinned vibration that you held across your chest is letting go of its grip. The discordant lines of your unreciprocated care are no longer being tracked or verified by an internal court case. The iron ladles have been dropped onto the flat stone. The dry clay jugs are resting in the dark cellar, and the high temple lamps have completely vanished beneath a blanket of silent, protective dark. You have permission to stop solving your life for tonight. The charred linen wicks, The empty storage vessels and the strategies for tomorrow do not require your presence while the masonry is cold. They can remain suspended in the shadows outside your window, completely separate from the living form that is resting here in the quiet. You are under no obligation to repair your entire biography before your eyes are allowed to close. You are permitted to be unwritten, unlit, and completely finished with the labor, resting within the safe sanctuary of an uncompromised night that asks for no bright flames before it offers you its blanket of rest. The teaching of the deep earth cellar is settling deep into the marrow of your bones now, filling the heavy spaces across your chest with an enveloping tenderness. You are returning home to the pristine silence that was always waiting beneath your desire to illuminate the path of others, the vast, unmeasured awareness that cannot be broken because it belongs to the raw, unpolished clay of your own presence. Let the universe carry its own silent turning for the next few hours, while your spirit drifts further away from the language of endless utility and transactional approval. Your sternum is loose, your core is heavy like cool pottery resting in the shade, and the still rhythm of the evening is cradling your weary body as you prepare to slide away into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. What if the true purpose of the vessel has always lived in its capacity to remain empty in the dark, rather than its duty to burn away for the light? The cold, damp masonry of the underground vault does not change its nature when the winter frost forms along its outer seams, and the deep floor of the cellar remains perfectly steady, whether it supports a row of overflowing jars or an array of empty pottery. All the frantic, heavy weight that contracted your chest wall during the day, the exhausting effort to prove that your compassion has no limits, and the sharp regret over the moments where your internal depletion made you pull away from another's request, all of it is losing its hold under the immense, cool dark of this late hour. The mind can finally lay down its heavy copper ladles because the space you occupy tonight cannot be split by an honest admission of exhaustion, nor can your true depth be measured by the brightness of the light you give away. You are simply here, a living presence breathing in the quiet, completely separate from the flawless fronts that were built for a yesterday you have already left behind. When we look directly into the wide, windless space of your own internal presence, we find that our true capacity for liberation is not an endless sacrifice reached through absolute self-depletion. It is much more like the profound, load-bearing depth of the unglazed clay that allows a dark, dry sediment line to run through its interior, while the remaining vessel continues to hold its shape with absolute stability. The pretense that felt so thin and brittle in your chest tonight was never your core reality. It was merely a temporary layer of soot gathered on the surface of your utility. You do not need to wash away the natural configuration of your human fatigue, and you do not need to force an artificial warmth out of a depleted frame. You only need to remain still, heavy, and entirely present, letting the empty tray rest on the workbench until the restless friction runs completely out of air. Think of how much vital energy has been traded in the effort to maintain a burning light for the approval of others, to force an exhausted mind to look perfectly serene before you permit your own muscles to find comfort. That constant holding, that perpetual readiness to defend your usefulness against the judgment of your own thoughts, is the very thing that has left your ribcage lines feeling so tight and cold at the end of the day. But tonight, the high temple altars are dark, and the crushing blocks are still. The natural depletion of your spirit is not a permanent failure of your compassion. It was simply a reaction to a changing world of immense interpersonal pressures, completely powerless to diminish the deep, unconditioned nature of the awareness resting against your bedding tonight. You do not need to fill the jar before you are allowed to rest, and you do not need to light the wick before your eyes are permitted to close. Let your attention sink down even further now, moving past the soft expansion of your chest and settling into the absolute immobility of your ribs and shoulders. Feel the profound, grounding weight of your upper body as it yields entirely to the support beneath you. Completely cradled by the quiet intelligence of the night, the dark storehouses have held the weight of the raw clay and the cold granite walls through thousands of freezes, without needing a single active flame to justify their existence. and they are fully capable of holding your weary limbs tonight. You do not have to hold the weight of your service anymore. Every unreturned favor, every hidden worry, and every expectation of excellence can remain exactly where it fell on the path outside, losing its structural power in the cooling night air. The breathing of your body is becoming so thin, so quiet, and so effortless that it feels like nothing more than a faint whisper of wind moving through a deep stone vault after the heavy oak doors have been barred for the season. There is no longer any separation between the immense silence of the cellar floor and the stillness that is expanding within your own skin. The thoughts that were replaying your past sacrifices a few hours ago have turned into pale, translucent shadows, dissolving into the deep, unmeasured pool of your awareness without leaving a single mark behind. You are returning to the ancient, untroubled home that existed long before the first wick was ever twisted out of linen, the silent, unlit space where you are already wide, already safe, and already deeply at peace. Let the final definitions of the day slip away entirely now, leaving your spirit as wide, cool, and unbothered as the vast masonry vault resting in the evening shade. There are no roles to perform, no oil levels to maintain, and no versions of your utility to defend in this beautiful protective dark. The universe will manage its own demands without your assistance, and the morning will bring its own light when the time is right. But right now, in this single pocket of pure presence, nothing is required of your chest but the simple willingness to drop the weight of the flame and rest. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy, rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your weary soul to slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep. The unglazed clay does not mourn the oil it gave to the lamp, nor does the stone basin apologize to the rain for sitting dry through the long heat of summer. All the lingering, cold vibrations that gathered along your ribs during the hours of tracking who returned your kindness, the exhaustion of trying to anticipate the hidden expectations of everyone around you, and the subtle, heavy guilt of having nothing left to offer, all of it is dissolving into the deep, unmoving shadow of this midnight room. The internal mechanism that keeps your posture guarded is running out of momentum because there is no audience left to illuminate, no relationship to secure with your fatigue, and no moral text that declares your exhaustion a defect. You are simply here, a physical frame releasing its breath into the dark, completely separate from the public utility you wore during the daylight hours. When we observe this deep, inner clearing through a quiet and unhurried awareness, we discover that true peace is not a reward earned by successfully fixing every single dynamic that drained you. It is the radical, simple freedom of changing your relationship with the depletion itself, allowing the internal landscape to remain empty for a season, without transforming that empty space into a personal indictment. The mind creates the second wound when it takes the raw, physical fatigue of an overextended system and wraps it in a narrative of failure, whispering that you must continuously perform your generosity to be worthy of a place in the dark. But the subterranean spring does not count the cups drawn from its surface, and the dark earth beneath the orchard roots does not check the health of the branches before it agrees to hold them steady through the frost. You are allowed to be empty. You are allowed to let the fire go completely out without believing that the vessel has been ruined. Think of how much vitality has been spent in the late night hours trying to perfect your responses, replaying the moments where you felt unappreciated, or trying to guarantee that your boundaries will be perfectly unshakable tomorrow. That continuous mental architecture, that defensive looping that treats every interpersonal friction as an emergency that must be solved before you sleep, is the very weight that leaves your chest wall feeling so thin and brittle. But tonight, the mountain trails are quiet, and the village wells are still. The boundary you failed to hold or the frustration you hid is merely a temporary ripple in a long, complex life of human connections, entirely unable to alter the profound, load-bearing awareness that is cradling your shoulders right now. You do not have to settle the accounts of your relationships before you rest, and you do not need to feel whole before you let your eyes close. Let your focus drop even deeper now, leaving the narrative of your modern tasks behind and settling fully into the heavy, immovable center of your lower core. Feel the quiet, supportive mass of your body, as it gives its entire weight to the stillness beneath you, perfectly held by an ancient natural intelligence that operates entirely outside the boundaries of human performance. The deep masonry foundations have held the cold stone through countless freezes without needing to generate a single spark of heat to prove their value. And your system is fully capable of resting in that exact same unlit security tonight. Every digital notification, every unreciprocated favor, and every expectation of absolute strength can remain suspended in the cool evening air outside, completely powerless to reach into this dark sanctuary. The movement of your breath is becoming so slow, so thin, and so unforced that it feels like nothing more than the faint, rhythmic rustle of dry reed grass along the edge of a frozen stream when the wind has completely died away. There is no longer any separation between the immense, dark space of the cellar and the stillness that is expanding within the framework of your bones. The worries that were spinning through your mind a few hours ago have turned into pale, translucent mist, dissolving into the wide, unconditioned landscape of your presence without leaving a single fracture behind. You are returning to the native, untroubled sanctuary that existed long before you ever learned to measure your worth by your utility, the silent, unpolished room where you are already wide, already safe, and already deeply at peace. Let the final definitions and roles of the day fall away into the floorboards, leaving your spirit as unmapped, cool and silent as the unglazed clay sitting in the deep earth. There are no expectations to satisfy, no oil levels to compute, and no versions of your devotion to defend in this beautiful, protective dark. The world will manage its own weights without your illumination for the next few hours, and the morning will bring its own design when the light is ready. But right now, in this single pocket of pure presence, nothing is required of your chest but the simple willingness to let the lamp go dark and rest. Let your mind dissolve completely into the heavy, rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your weary soul to slide effortlessly into a deep, peaceful, and dreamless sleep.